Well, all right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to history class. We have come to the end of the line, the final lesson of the year. It's been fun. We've covered, several hundred years now. World history, several thousand. And yet all good things must come to an end. So pretty soon, summer shall be upon us in just 48 hours. So, from when I'm filming this, I guess 24 probably by the time you're finished. Anyway, so when we last left off, we were talking about the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks and the American position of taking this view of the war on terror, that we were going to go after Islamic radicalism wherever it reared its head in an unpeaceful way. And in the context of this sense of we're never going to let anything happen like this again, comes a new controversy with an old foe. So Saddam Hussein, who we had gone to war with in 1991 when Bush Sr., or George H.W. Bush, was in charge, rears his head again with his son George W. Bush now in charge. And incidentally, I wonder what Herbert did to get kicked out of W's name, right? So George Herbert Walker Bush, and then is George Walker Bush was Bush 41 really mad at Herbert and I want to name him after myself, but I'll leave the Herbert out. I don't know. Maybe Herbert had done something bad. Who knows? Anyway, I digress. So in the midst of this, intelligence starts to report, and I should say not just American intelligence, but also British and Israeli intelligence as well, begins to report that Saddam Hussein was deep into a search for the development of weapons of mass destruction. In this case, we were specifically concerned about a nuclear program, although there also, had long been established that Saddam had used chemical weapons before, including against his own people, as well as against Iran during the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. So we knew that he had chemical weapons. There was some evidence he was stockpiling more of them, but there was also evidence that he was trying to go nuclear. And this was a bit of scary news in the context of just having seen, what 20 guys were able to do with a few airplanes. The idea of someone, from that part of the world with arguably a similar agenda getting control of nuclear weapons was a bad deal. And remember the story when I first introduced the character of Saddam, how we talked about how, he supposedly, shot a guy for asking to leave a cabinet meeting to go attend the birth of his child. So, I think one of the other story I heard about him was, he once had a child tortured for insulting him on a chalkboard when he was, an elementary school kid. So, the dude's unstable, and we don't want him to be able to nuke things, right? That's not good news. The other thing that we were concerned about was that in the event that he got nuclear weapons, even if he decided not to use them, that he might be willing to deal with some of these radical groups and sell the technology to them. And we already know, they're suicide bombers. We already know Al-Qaeda is not going to be afraid of using nuclear weapons. Remember, the reason we managed to avoid Soviet, nuclear war with the Soviets was largely this idea of mutually assured destruction theory, which was that, we knew if we used nukes and the Soviets knew if they used nukes, then the response was the other side was going to use them as well, and we were going to wind up with a really terrible situation. The problem is this doesn't work on suicide bombers who have a theology that says that they get special treatment in heaven if they died killing infidels. So you knew Al-Qaeda would use nuclear weapons if they got their hands on them. Now, how well Saddam got along with these terror groups is a matter of some controversy. At the time, that was part of the case that was made to the public was that there were close connections between Saddam and Al Qaeda, and there were even some statements made, I think particularly by the Vice President Dick Cheney, who had been. We should say Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney was a Wyoming congressman. He also had been the Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush. So he was secretary, and I believe he'd served in some capacity in the Ford administration as well, if I recall. He was one of the most. He was one of the least camera-friendly, vice presidential candidates you've ever gotten. Bush picked him as his VP because he really wanted his expertise. And Cheney, especially in the first term, he kind of loses some influence in the second term, according to most people. But in the first term, he's possibly the most important vice president of all time, because he is very much an architect of the Iraq policy, and he's kind of Bush's go-to advisor. I mean, people try, people, particularly critics of Bush on the left, tried to kind of paint this picture of Cheney being like the puppet master pulling Bush's strings. That's a crude exaggeration. I look, the president's his own man. He made his own decisions, and I don't think anyone who knows George W. Bush, doesn't think he's a strong-willed person. But the reason that kind of parody image emerged was because of how influential Cheney was in shaping policy. But I got off of that to say that, Cheney had kind of intimated in an interview somewhere on the news that there was some evidence tying Saddam perhaps to 9/11. That turned out not really to have been the case. But there are other people that say actually that those two groups would not have gotten along together at all, that part of what Al Qaeda wanted to do was to overthrow these secular dictatorships in the Middle East, like the Saudi Arabian monarchy and Saddam's kind of military dictatorship. So there's a lot of dispute about that. However, it still is the case you cannot let Saddam get nuclear weapons. It's still the case that if you do let Saddam get nuclear weapons, whether he was on board with the Islamist agenda or not, and he was not a Sharia law guy. I mean, he's probably, he probably went to Friday prayer like a good Muslim's supposed to do, but he was not a particularly devout Muslim by any means. So. Anyway, we come to the conclusion that Saddam just cannot be allowed to get these weapons. We try to step up going through the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was a UN-attached organization that kind of monitors nuclear proliferation. We tried to step up their number of weapons inspections in Iraq to make sure that Saddam was not developing nuclear weapons. Iraq refused to cooperate, refused to allow international weapons inspectors to check for their stockpiles and so on. And so the decision was made to put together a coalition to invade Iraq and take Saddam Hussein out if he will not back down off of this nuclear proliferation. And I should say, I neglected to mention this in yesterday's video, which was a mistake on my part, that the war in Afghanistan was actually one of the few times in history that a NATO country had actually triggered the alliance clause and called for everyone in NATO to send troops. And so Afghanistan, really, we were joined by all the NATO countries, and then also a number of countries from other parts of the world. Like there are even troops from Latin America or from some of the Asian democracies that were going to fight with us in Afghanistan. Normally in small numbers. They weren't sending, for the most part, other than the British, they weren't sending tons of troops. But they sent enough to meet their obligations. So there were actually as many as 30 countries involved in the Afghan war. With the U.S. making up more than half of the troops. But nonetheless, it adds up. Even though it may only be a few hundred troops from each country, that adds up. So in Iraq, we try to do the same thing. We can't really go the whole NATO treaty trigger route because, unlike with Afghanistan, Iraq hadn't openly attacked us. This was an attempt at preemptive war. The idea was there's going to be a war eventually. Let's win it now before he has, nukes. So. We get, we do get several countries to send troops. The so-called coalition of the willing, we called them. The biggest contributor outside of us was the British again, under Tony Blair was the prime minister at the time. And and this actually winds up costing him his career in Britain. This was a unpopular decision on his part among the British people. But ultimately, we get this coalition together, and we go in and we overthrow Saddam Hussein's regime. And this is another one, like the Gulf War, that you really were able to watch a lot of it unfold on TV. Not necessarily the ground engagements with people getting shot at, but you could watch the buildings getting bombed and so on. The early phase of the war, and I vividly remember the night that it went down pretty well. I remember we watched the news at school for like 2 days. But and all this is happening, I believe it was 2002, maybe 3, when the Iraq War gets started. March of 2003. So we've been at war in Afghanistan for a year or so already, and now we're going to be fighting 2 wars simultaneously, right? Because the Afghan war is still going on officially. So, although with much lower troop levels than you would have had in 2005 or something. So, 2003. We start trying to wage this 2-front war, which, we basically did that in World War II. The Japanese and German wars were basically 2 different wars that we've called one. But, so we start with a period that is known as the shock and awe period, which was where we just deployed missile after missile after missile, just bombing the tar out of Iraq. One thing we had done, by the time of the Iraq War, our missile technology had gotten so sophisticated that we were able to target things a lot more closely than we once could have. And so we put a lot of thought into what buildings we had to do to bring down Saddam's government, what buildings we had to blow up to bring down Saddam's government without doing excessive damage, because once again, as with Afghanistan, and perhaps even more ambitiously in Iraq, we had decided that when Saddam was removed, the second goal of the war was to install a democratic government in Iraq. And this is maybe where the problems begin, because I think most people, except a few diehard, have kind of, even within the Republicans, most people have kind of said in hindsight that maybe Bush was a little overly optimistic about the ability to just install democracy in a Middle Eastern context. But we'll see how that plays out in a minute. So the shock and awe era, we're trying to preserve enough of the infrastructure as we can for the new Iraqi government that we plan to install. But in the process, we would try to bring Saddam to his knees, and it really happens very quickly. It happens as quickly as we drove Iraq out of Kuwait in 92. It's not that much longer to drive Saddam out of power in his own country. Saddam ultimately winds up, after fleeing, was finally found hiding in what was called, quote, a spider hole, which was this basically underground lair he'd built, and he came out with just this insane beard and just looking haggard, And so there's this moment in 2003 where Saddam Hussein has been captured. He ultimately is going to be tried for previous crimes against humanity by the new Iraqi government that is installed in his place, and is actually sentenced to die by hanging. They go old school and hang the fella. There's this, I remember when this happened, there was this really dramatic scene of troops in Iraq, like a tank tying a rope around the tank and pulling down this famous statue of Saddam Hussein that was built up in Iraq. And after this happened, President Bush went out and made a speech on a United States aircraft carrier with a banner in the backdrop that said "Mission accomplished." And at this point, it really looked like the Iraq War was a raging success. But said success would not last long, because we found out that it was very easy to depose Saddam, but it was very hard to impose democracy. So a couple things start happening in Iraq where it starts to go into a kind of chaotic state. First thing is, we can't find these so-called WMDs, these weapons of mass destruction that the people had been, promised was the reason we went to war. They never really turn up. We never find any physical evidence of atomic weapons. We do find some evidence of chemical weapons, and in fact, the evidence of a stockpile of chemical weapons turns up a week before the 2004 election and saves Bush's re-election, because it was a very close race. He was a slight underdog to the Massachusetts Senator John Kerry, who was the Democrat, because the war was starting to get unpopular. Although a lot of people, were still concerned about, national security in the whole context of post 9/11 era and everything. But finding those chemical weapons like the week before saves Bush's re-election. But as far as what the people have been told we were going to war for, it seems now like it was a massive intelligence failure. Like the CIA was just wrong. And when you think about it, like that is the fact that we would go in, start a war, depose a regime, get caught up in what is ultimately going to turn out to be us trying to take sides in a 6-year civil war, maybe even more than I'd have to do the math. Yeah, maybe even a little more than that. That's a pretty big price to pay for a mistake by your intelligence agencies. Now, if you want to because personally, I have flip-flopped on the Iraq War like a dozen times in my life. Because the reality is, we know that it played out in a way that it looks like it was a bad deal. But at the same time, if we had done nothing, and then Saddam had gotten weapons of mass destruction, we'd have been in a world of hurt. But the Iraq War, though, it never really turns up the promise that we had been told, that there were all these weapons of mass destruction. It's not out of the question that there were, I don't think. But it certainly seems like the whole thing, it was a little fishy. And I don't say that implying any kind of conspiracy theory. I know a lot of people, especially on the left, love to say that. Even Trump said it in a Republican debate in 2016, which I kind of got angry at the TV when that happened, because I think pretty highly of George W. Bush as a person, whether I agree with every policy decision or not. I don't believe for a second that he was was trying to willfully lie America into a war with Iraq or whatever. Especially people say, oh, they were trying to do all this to take the oil. Well, we didn't. We literally were paying, to import oil from the United States at 4 times the cost of filling up at an Iraqi gas station, because we so wanted to avoid the perception of that we were taking Iraqi oil. So, anyone who says, oh, we went to Iraq to control the oil supply. Well, if we did that, we did it in a really dumb way, because we never actually took control of the oil supply. So anyway, so that's a thing. That's a problem. There's increasing. A lot of people are like, why are we over there when it doesn't seem like, what we had gone to war over may have even been a real thing. Well, here is where things take another turn. Is that then when you move to the second part of the mission, which is trying to install democracy. And Bush's foreign policy was somewhat influenced by kind of Wilsonian kind of way of thinking. He was very optimistic that it is shown in here's why the whole democracy in the Middle East thing was such a big project for the Bush administration. It's been demonstrated pretty clearly that democracies very rarely, hardly ever, go to war with each other. Most wars in history are either between dictatorships or between a democracy and a dictatorship. There's very, very few times where two countries have democratically decided to go to war with one another. So the thought process was we needed peace in the Middle East because at the time the American economy was deeply dependent on Middle Eastern oil. And because of that, we were constantly having to involve ourselves in Middle Eastern affairs. And a lot of these involvements were not peaceful because the Middle East was filled with dictatorships of both secular, like Saddam, and Islamic theocratic, like Khomeini and then his successor Khamenei in Iran. So, we had all these dictatorships. The only real functioning democracy in the Middle East was Israel. Of course, Israel and the Arabs had their thing. So we thought if you created a world where all these Arab countries were democracies, we thought it would bring peace to America, it would bring peace to Israel, it would bring stability to the world economy, that people wouldn't be so dependent on this turbulent powder keg region for energy consumption and all this kind of stuff. Well, the problem with that turns out to be that because democracy had not developed organically, when given the right to vote, they immediately responded by, continuing to function based on old tribal and sectarian issues. So, and because corruption and greasing people's palms and all that stuff was just a part of the culture of how government functioned in that part of the world. No one over there thought that there was anything wrong with continuing to, force people to give the guy who signs the passport $50 to sign it, So you wind up with, similar to what happened in Afghanistan, you wind up with a corrupt Iraqi regime that was barely worth propping up. But the other thing about it is that Iraq was a unique powder keg because it was kind of an arbitrary country drawn together based on British imperial needs after World War I. And it combined several populations. So you had Iraq was one of only, Iraq and Iran are, as far as I'm aware, the only majority Shiite nations in the Islamic world. There may be one other. So they were about 2/3 Shiite and about 1/3 Sunni. Now, Saddam had been a Sunni and therefore had favored the Sunnis. So you have the Sunnis are the minority, but they've been used to being in power. The Shiites now gain the majority because when you give everyone a right to vote, that means 2/3 of the people that can vote are going to be Shiite. So now a lot of the Shiites want to get elected so that they can go oppress the Shiites want to get elected so that they can oppress the Sunnis the same way the Sunnis had oppressed them during the years that Saddam was in power. Also, we had pursued a policy known as de-Baathification. So the Ba'ath Party was the party in which Saddam was a member. We had wanted people who were in Saddam's government not to hold positions, but that further irritated the Sunnis because basically the natural leadership class of the Sunni bloc had taken part in Saddam's government, whether they fully supported him or not. And so that was shifting even more power to the Shiites. So this is going to lead to civil war breaking out in Iraq between the Sunni and Shiite militias. And we are going to be kind of caught in the middle. Now, in the midst of all that, the other problem that we're having is this new Iraqi democracy, because it is majority Shiite. The other Shiite nation in the world was Iran, and Iran had, as the only Shiite government in the world for decades, had kind of naturally assumed the leadership position in the Shiite world. And so now the new Iraqi government that we put in there is now increasingly friendly to our longtime enemy, the Iranians. Well, now we've got the civil war breaking out, and you've got a lot of extreme Shiite militias that are tied to Iran, and in fact, a lot of Iranian troops crossed the border and fought in the Iraq War. It's really kind of almost a wonder that we didn't go to war with Iran, because it's so similar to China and the Korean War, like we really kind of almost did. But then you have the Sunni militias that started to emerge, and some of them were trying to kind of preserve the Sunni privilege that had been in Iraq, but also trying to avoid being persecuted by the Shiites. In particular, there was a fellow by the name of Muqtada al-Sadr, led one of the most infamous of the Sunni militia groups. And it evolves into what was known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. So Al-Qaeda begins to flood into Iraq. And one thing about dictatorships is that they stifle, real life to a great degree, but they also are usually pretty good at keeping security. And so sometimes, we've seen a dictator overthrown and thought, oh, this is great, the dictator's gone, but then it turns into chaos, which can be worse at times. And so, if you were a Christian in Iraq, you probably were upset with this, because what happens, they get persecuted worse in the anarchy that happens after Saddam falls than they did under Saddam. It was a little dangerous to be a Christian in Iraq under Saddam, but after Saddam falls, all these radical Islamic militias start coming in and they start killing everybody. Actually winds up sadly driving most of the Christians out of Iraq, and they actually had a decent-sized Christian population. So now there is a mess on our hands. We get involved in battles kind of against extremists on both of these sides. The most famous battles fought in Iraq are the siege of Fallujah and the Battle of Ramadi. Things are going pretty bad. You got these terrorists showing up, and it turns into, the first part of the war, when we're fighting Saddam, it's like conventional warfare. It's like a lot of aerial bombings and a lot of like war from the air. But when there are engagements on the ground, it's like battle lines on fields, and we're great at that. But then it turns into guerrilla warfare when we get into this whole like caught in the middle of the Civil War phase of things. And then it really turns into a real mess. Ultimately, the tide of the war starts to turn back in our favor a little bit with a couple events. One was called the Sunni Awakening, which was a period where we were able to convince a lot of the Sunni chieftains and stuff that the Iraqi government would protect their rights, and actually got some of the Sunnis to turn in some of the key provinces against the Sunni radicals and start supporting the government. And then this is followed and accompanied by something that was known as the troop surge. So we had been trying to keep a relatively light footprint in Iraq because we were trying to fight, two wars at once. We finally decided that what we needed to do is just send in more troops than we had ever planned on. But it winds up increasing the security situation in Iraq and winds up kind of getting things relatively under control. Because by 2006, Bush is able to win re-election in 2004 in a close race. But then in 2006, the Republicans get slaughtered in the midterm elections. The Democrats take both houses of Congress big. That's a combination of Iraq becoming increasingly unpopular, combined with some scandals as far as some corruption scandals and even a sex abuse scandal with some key congressmen contributed to that. So by 2006, it seemed like the people had really kind of turned against the war. It looked like this is going to be a thing like Vietnam, where the people just wouldn't support staying in. And in the midst of all that, Bush, with some prodding from his old foe turned sometime ally McCain, can help convince him to do this. Bush actually doubles down on the troop levels, sends in more troops than we'd ever had. And it actually seems like going into the 2008 presidential election, it looked like we may have actually salvaged victory in Iraq. But the question was, is it precarious? Do you have to literally be over there 100 years in order to maintain that peace? Because at some point, you don't want to have your troops committed over there forever, right? And at some point, when you leave, is it just going to go back to pieces again? And the answer more or less is yes, because ultimately, when Obama is elected president, we'll get to that in just a minute, but after he's elected president, he is going to pull troops out. He's going to become president largely off of running against the Iraq War. He's going to pull troops out of Iraq after about a year or so, maybe even a year and a half. Well, some of the left was starting to get irritated how long he left troops in there because when he ran on a peace candidacy. But but it's one thing to say I'm not going to do the X, Y, and Z, while I'm running, and then when I'm actually being given the daily intelligence briefings, it's a different thing to actually follow through with some of that stuff. Ultimately, what's going to happen when we do largely leave Iraq, which happens around 2009 or 2010, in the vacuum left by our absence, a new and even more radical Islamic terror group emerges known as ISIS. And they wind up actually not just launching a couple random terror attacks like Al-Qaeda did. They actually take a piece of land in Iraq and also a piece of land in Syria, which had gone into a civil war by that time. And they carve out a region for themselves out of much of Iraq and Syria and actually declare the caliphate, declare that this is, a Sharia government. And in addition to sponsoring terrorist attacks across the world, they actually are taking ground and just doing unconscionable things, literally coming into villages and just beheading all the religious minorities. ISIS really sends a shiver down everyone's spine about 10 years ago, and they were so extreme that people kind of looked at Al-Qaeda as kind of being sellouts. That's how extreme they were. And a lot of the people that kind of left Al-Qaeda to go support ISIS because they looked like they were the ones who were actually going to get the job done finally, And ISIS was a little bit more primitive. Al-Qaeda, they like these really sophisticated, years-long plans that lead to trade centers going down. ISIS just wanted to sow chaos. They just would send one guy to go shoot up a church or a mosque or of another denomination of Islam or something like that. They would, and they were basically this kind of thug militia or whatever. We actually had to send troops back into Iraq. It didn't, so Obama had run as the peace candidate, pulled the troops out, and then actually had to send them back in. And we actually had troops back in Iraq, not on the same kind of full-scale war basis, but on more of a advisory/assistance basis toward the end of the Obama administration and the first year or so of the Trump administration. We actually had troops back in Iraq again fighting ISIS. So did we win or lose the Iraq War? It's really not that cut and dried in some cases. I think we'll tend now to probably say that it was a war that we lost, but that's really just because, we don't necessarily think that Iraq became what we wanted it to become, which is a functioning democracy where Sunnis and Shiites are, having polite debates and figuring out policy and peacefully going on. That never happened. They wound up being an ally to Iran, who's our longtime rival in the region. It spurred the creation of ISIS. In hindsight, most people would say, if you say, did we win or lose Iraq, we'd probably say, yeah, we probably lost it. But the question is, was that a loss that had to have happened? Some people say, hey, if we'd have left troops in there in the first place, if Obama hadn't pulled troops out, we might have had a different situation. But then the question becomes, how long do you want to stay over there? Do you feel like you have won the war if you commit to having American troops in Iraq for 30 years in order to keep their country going? It's the same question with Afghanistan. So, very, very difficult time. And the Iraq War, you could tell, had a big impact. I mean, it had a big impact on my political philosophy as far as making me a little more distrustful of, the ability of military force to change things in quite the way that I always assumed it could. But it led to a lot of the Republicans from the 70s or the late 60s through the maybe even going back into the 50s, honestly. The Republicans of the Cold War era and into the Iraq War were a very hawkish party that really believed in a lot of foreign intervention. And then you see, in the midst of the Iraq wars, you really see a major trend of Republican politics moving a little bit away from that, with more non-interventionist candidates like Rand Paul and people like that, Mike Lee, all those sorts of guys. And then, of course, the Iraq War had always been unpopular with Democrats, at least as far as the rank and file. Most of the Democratic leadership actually voted for the war when it started. But then, once it became obvious that it wasn't super politically popular, they started turning on it. Typically, if you go back to, you didn't have that much of a phenomenon in, say, the Korean War of, parties really arguing against the war too much once it gets started, or trying to turn on the commander in chief in the middle of the war. But I think the Democrats did kind of do that after having voted to start it. Then it really started criticizing Bush a lot in the midst of it. And I'm not sure how I feel about that, because in hindsight, I think the people that didn't want the war in Iraq, I think, were probably right in hindsight, but they were probably right for the wrong reasons too. In a lot of ways. And some of the rhetoric, one of the things when you have a situation like war, it's hard to say, the other side is probably right that we shouldn't be there, even though, they're saying all these terribly unpatriotic things that I don't like at the same time, and, all this kind of stuff. So, it was hard for, a lot of conservatives to buck against the Iraq War as it was going on. Anyway, the other thing that is really controversial related to the whole war on terror era here is that the Bush administration takes a lot of heat for some laws that they passed, one known as the Patriot Act, that were meant to give the government more tools to fight terrorism, but were arguably unfortunate developments as it relates to civil rights in criminal cases. And so a lot of laws were passed that gave the government, made it a lot easier for the government to spy on people, including citizens. There were certainly some incidents where, terrorists were detained without trial for extended periods of time. I'm a little less concerned about that because they are not, American citizens typically, if you were a captured fighter, captured on the foreign field, but there was maybe a little bit of excessive holding people for extended periods of time and so on. But I think what's really concerning was that starting in the Bush years and then continuing through the Obama years, you had a lot of spying by the government on its own citizens. The NSA, the National Security Agency, was discovered to have been basically keeping a record of every phone conversation that was made in the United States without a warrant. Just an awful lot of stuff that was justified on the grounds of we're trying to do anything we can to prevent another 9/11. But, then there's the whole thing of who's really more dangerous, the American government if it decides not to respect rights, or some goat herder in a cave, right? I mean, so, who's really more to be scared of if they decide to, not to respect rights. So, so that was a big controversy. How far do you go in, there even were some cases of, terrorists being tortured and stuff like that, which, you can debate how big of a deal that was, and different people will come to different conclusions on that. I think, most people would allow some extracurricular activities if they thought it was going to stop a ticking bomb, but, did it actually work, and did we kind of make ourselves too much like the bad guys we were fighting in doing some of those things? That was a really potent argument at the time. Well, we're at the 40-minute mark here, so let me try to see if I can at least finish the Bush years in a few minutes here. So another major thing that happens poor Bush had a rough second term, and I'm a supporter of the fellow, but he had a rough second term. So between the Iraq War going bad, and then comes Hurricane Katrina, which is probably one of the worst natural disasters in American history, led to many of the states of on the Gulf of Mexico, Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, having very, very severe damage. Unlike almost anything in recent years, in FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, really botched the response. So that was a big deal, hurt Bush's popularity a lot. But I mean, more importantly than that, I mean, a lot of people lost their lives or homes. Then you had the fact that for all that Bush really and the Republican Congress, despite having all run on a platform of we're gonna not spend money, we're gonna cut tax, they really wound up spending money even worse than things had been in the previous decades, and so we wound up with ungodly deficits, which is only going to get worse when Obama comes in there, because then they're going to go. I mean, so Bush did a really bad job of managing the deficit, but some of that was because he's trying to fight two wars at once, without massive tax increases. And in fact, having cut taxes right before the wars started. But if Bush lets the deficit get to here, Obama's going to come in and let the deficit get to here. So that was a problem. One thing that Bush did that was great was Bush was probably the strongest pro-life president maybe we've ever had. And he is able to get past a federal law that banned partial birth abortion, which is a particularly brutal form of abortion. I won't describe for your sanity, but it involves scissors and it's really bad. And it happens like as the child is like partially being born. So they're basically, ready to be delivered. And he actually is able to get that illegalized nationwide, and the Supreme Court actually upholds the law and allows that regulation to continue. So he illegalized that, which was probably the biggest victory that the pro-life movement has ever had. But one other, and Bush did do some great stuff as far as international humanitarian aid and stuff. He did a lot to kind of help Africa deal with their mosquito problems and some things like that too. The other real crisis that Bush has to face is in the last year of his presidency. The economy that had been in a virtually endless state of economic boom since the Reagan years, with the exception of the brief recession, which cost Papa Bush his job. But for basically 18 of the last 20 years, it had been economic growth. There went my thing. Hold on. Lost my stand. Trying to get like a speck off of the camera, and there it all. So, you'd had this kind of continual economic growth, and then in 2008, there is a major financial crisis. With this little time left in the video, I won't go deep into all the details, but a lot of it was built around the crash of the real estate market. And a lot of banks had started backing up. They had started buying and trading people's mortgages and loans and stuff, and backing up certain securities like stocks and bonds with these mortgages. And a lot of it came from some of which was government inspired, giving a lot of mortgages to people that really weren't going to be able to pay them off. And then these assets being sold back and forth. The whole thing collapses, causes a massive credit crunch, which is basically going to cause it to be a thing where no one could get a loan for months, which means that no one could buy homes, which meant that construction workers had nothing to work on. No one could buy cars, which meant that manufacturers had no reason to keep making as many cars. It was going to, the thing about economic crises is they can spread into other areas really, really quickly, as you're maybe seeing a little bit with our current situation, but this one was a little different because it's less connected to something just coming in and wiping out a good economy overnight, and more connected to slow developments that had kind of been ticking time bombs. And this economic crisis is just a tremendous problem, and it causes Bush agrees to a law called TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which pumped billions of dollars of stimulus money and trying to bail out some of the banks that had helped cause the problem, because the idea was that these banks were too big to fail. If all these major banks, if Bank of America and Lehman Brothers and Wells Fargo and all these places go under, no one's going to be able to get a loan. Our economy isn't going to be able to function for years. So they said, even though it was kind of their fault and they caused it, they're bailing out these banks and all these different people. This winds up causing a weird thing where the far left and the far right really were united in opposition to the center left and center right. It was a very rare moment in politics, because you're like Occupy Wall Street, anti-Wall Street left, and you're, deeply free market, government stay out of things right, combine forces against, the people in the middle that feel like you can manage it at one level or another. And, so this unlikely alliance is formed, and this whole thing continues into the 2008 election. When Obama gets elected, he's going to dump even more trillions of dollars into stimulus projects that were sometimes controversial. The United States basically bought the majority ownership of General Motors, which they then sold on the stock market or whatever. But we basically took over GM for a couple of years. Just a lot of stuff that a lot of people thought was kind of threatening the kind of free market way of doing things. Ultimately, and meanwhile, there was a gasoline crisis that is partly connected to the wars in the Middle East, partly connected to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and a handful of other factors that led to gasoline. I remember I was in college, when this would have happened. My senior year in college was the year Obama was running. I guess I graduated in 2000. It would have been my junior year, actually. I graduated in 2009. So I remember in college, gas at one point in time was like $4.50 a gallon at one point, which in today's dollars with inflation is kind of like paying closer to $5.50 now. So that's how expensive gasoline was at that time, which is just insane to think about. Which that was bringing the economy to a halt because people didn't want to commute. Because if you did have to commute an hour for your job, if you lived in an area like Saluda and you wanted to commute to Augusta or Columbia for work, well, you were eating so much of your budget was getting eaten into by gas that it didn't do you well to commute. And so, that hurt a lot of people. So, and the economy really didn't recover from the crash of 2008 for 5, 6, 7 years before it really got back to kind of what we were used to. So, in the midst of the Iraq War and the economic crash is happening the 2008 election. And the 2008 election pitted John McCain, actually kind of pulled off the upset in the Republican primary, and became the nominee. And then the Democrats were expected to nominate Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton's first lady, who had then become a senator for the state of New York, even though she was from Arkansas, but she just moved to New York just to run for Senate. Which is kind of messed up. But anyway, so Hillary Clinton had become a senator. She was a high-profile figure. She was expected to waltz to the Democratic nomination. And then a funny thing happened. A freshman senator who'd only been in the Senate for 2 years from the state of Illinois by the name of Barack Obama ran for president for the Democratic nomination and pulled off a shocking upset, shocked the world. Obama became the first African American to become a major party presidential nominee, and he was a very gifted orator. Made a really strong speech. He ran a very positive campaign, focused on the themes like very broad themes like hope and change. He didn't want to get bogged down into his policy discussions that much. And the reason for that was because Obama actually was the most far-left candidate, with the possible exception of McGovern, that had pretty much ever run at that time, which is funny now because, if you could have 2008 Obama try to go through a Democratic primary nowadays, he would get tarred and feathered for, because the Democrats have just moved so far left so fast, it makes your head spin. So Obama runs this kind of he was never a centrist on issues, even in '08. He was definitely a strong liberal, the most liberal that ever run, but he ran kind of a centrist themed campaign of kind of appealing to unity and that kind of thing. And he winds up actually winning the presidency in what would have been very unlikely at the beginning of 2008 to have expected that. I don't really have time to go through the Obama years and do it justice. With just a few minutes left here before it's the video's pushing an hour and y'all are wanting to jump off a bridge. But I should say that simultaneously, regardless of what you think of his presidency, I think it is probably a major moment in American history that a black man was able to become president, and kind of what that signified for the amount of progress that had been made, and certainly that was a special moment for a lot of black people who thought they would never see the day. However, that being said, Obama winds up not being a very good president at all. In my view, of course, obviously, I've got a certain viewpoint on certain things, but one thing about Obama, he was very radically left on social issues. He had when he was in the Illinois State Senate, he voted against a bill called the Infants Born Alive Protection Act. It just said that if a baby survives an abortion, you can't starve it to death, and he did not vote in favor of it. And so he continued that during his presidency, even trying to force Christian charities to provide birth control that some Catholics and some others thought was against their specific beliefs, but even providing abortions. And he literally took a Catholic charity called the Little Sisters for the Poor. He took a bunch of nuns all the way to the Supreme Court to force them, to provide abortions for their employees. You're suing nuns to make them fund abortions. Are you kidding me? He winds up appointing two of the most radical justices in the history of the Supreme Court. In particular, Sonia Sotomayor, who might be the most radical, and they wind up being two of the justices that decide in 2015 in the Obergefell versus Hodges case to make gay marriage legal nationwide by Supreme Court edict, in what Antonin Scalia, the conservative justice, said was a judicial putsch or a judicial coup. Basically said the Supreme Court had overthrown the will of the people in that case. You had Obama winds up passing something called the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare in the way most people talk about it, which wound up making healthcare a lot less affordable for a lot of people. It did help some people at the bottom, and it did make it to where you could get health insurance if you had a pre-existing condition, which helped a lot of people, although this is also sort of like saying you can get fire insurance while your house is burning down. Kind of defeats the purpose of insurance, but nonetheless, was... There went my stand again. Nonetheless, was kind of beneficial toward... I'll just hold it, I guess. Nonetheless, was kind of, beneficial to some people, but in the process, really made... healthcare a lot more expensive for a lot of other people, and the prices of healthcare have kind of shot through the roof ever since. Plus it brought a deep level of government involvement in that. He continues he once again was someone who did not put a lot of emphasis or care about the debt and deficit issue, and the national debt literally starts ticking up into the trillions of dollars. Now I want you to remember that $1 trillion actually means 1,000 billion is a trillion. So when I talk about 2 trillion, remember we're talking about, like, if I say $2 trillion in debt, I mean $2,000 billion in debt. That's a tremendous amount of debt, to say the least, and probably set up a situation where at some point the finances of the United States government, if something radical doesn't take place soon, are going to crash at some point in the future, and it's going to be ugly. And a lot of it's going to be due to the funding of Social Security. One thing I forgot to mention with Bush, he had a plan that would have been brilliant, that if it had passed, I think would have been probably his signature thing, which he wanted people to be able to start managing some of their own Social Security funds and, like, investing them in the stock market and stuff like that, based on what a plan that was used by some other countries like Chile. And I really think if that had passed, it would have done really well for people and would have kind of stopped the kind of coming fiscal Armageddon, but Bush was not able to get support for it, even from Republicans in Congress, so it went nowhere, sadly, in my view. So Obama comes in, he ends the Iraq War, but then has to go back in because of the emergence of ISIS. You can question whether he ended it too soon or not. I'm kind of undecided on that question. The one thing that I give him credit for was making the decision to launch the Bin Laden raid into Pakistan, which I addressed yesterday. I'm trying to think of some other important things that happened during that time. There were some scandals involving, using the IRS to against conservative groups and a few other things like that. There were some scandals there. One thing that happens in response to Obama is the emergence of the so-called Tea Party movement, which was a kind of a very radically free market populist movement within Republican politics that kind of led to a civil war within the GOP, between your kind of the types of Republicans that had kind of been in office for the last, X amount of years, and you're more like a diehard, no, the government shouldn't touch anything, kind of a little bit more of a libertarian bent. And I was all in on the Tea Party movement. I was a fan, although there were X amount of people hanging around it that were obviously kooks, but but the ones that were legit, I tended to see the world in similar ways. But the Tea Party, I think, got a little overexcited about some things where they couldn't get any compromise, helped it make it to where there could be no compromises at all. But at the same time, the reason for that was because the Republican leadership kind of kept not keeping promises that they'd made on the campaign trail over and over again. And so there's a little bit of validity to both sides of that civil war inside of the GOP. Either way, by the time of the Obama era, the Clinton years were very nasty, and then the Bush years got a little nastier. And by the time you get to the Obama years, the Republicans and Democrats in Congress were not working together at all. And both sides were moving to more extreme viewpoints, for better or for worse, depending on your political views. Ultimately, a lot happened during those years. If we had another day or two, I could do, probably a whole bunch of lessons on those years. But it leads us to 2016, probably the most surprising result in the history of presidential elections. Donald Trump, who had been a famous real estate developer, owner of casinos, and then a reality TV star, decides to run for the Republican nomination and wins, and probably the biggest upset in maybe in political history. Then winds up winning an even bigger upset than what he did in the primaries, is actually winning the general election against Hillary Clinton, who had made one more comeback after having served as Secretary of State during the Obama years. Trump loses the popular vote but wins the Electoral College and the presidency. And then, you've lived through most of the last couple of years. But if you've been paying attention, one of the most tumultuous periods of kind of partisan conflict and just Washington nonsense that we've ever had. So that brings us about up to the present. Oh, and then I guess I should say about 2 months ago, this virus came through and just killed a gazillion people and knocked the economy on its knees, and we weren't able to have school. That'll be in the history books. Your kids are going to study about that at some point. So, hey, you lived through that one. You're officially old enough to have been in the history books now. You'll be able to tell your kids, I remember when we couldn't have school for 3 months because, I got so far behind, my idiot teacher kept making me watch these stupid YouTube videos. It'll be great. So anyway, that brings us basically to the end of the history of the United States up until this point. I wish I could have had a little more time to talk about the last 12 or 15 years, but it is what it is. So, anyway, let me know if you have any questions. Don't forget to do the test I'm going to be sending out today. Don't forget to finish your rough drafts. Not your rough drafts, to finish your final drafts if you didn't get an A on your rough. And then, hey, have yourselves a good summer, and I'll see you in the fall. Take care.